Well, this is not a normal Easter. This day of typically unambiguous and overabundant joy and celebration is shaded with some sadness because we can't be together in the same place. Every year, one of my favorite parts of Easter is something that I usually forget until I arrive early in the church that morning. It's that you can smell it. As soon as you cross the threshold of the church on Easter morning, your senses are arrested by the smell of Easter lilies brightening the air. A poignant reminder that this is a day where we celebrate the resurrection of a body, one that senses and smells and touches and tastes. I am sad that you are not here to smell these lilies with me. Of course, I am sad about more than just your olfactory deprivations. It feels like this coronavirus has robbed us of something precious. Because bad stuff happening is not exactly unusual. We're quite accustomed to it. And every year during Holy Week, or any other week of the year for that matter, there are any number of painful things happening in our world and our community. And yet amidst those varieties of pain, we gather together in church for comfort, yes, but also to make some transcendent sense, to make meaning out of those painful experiences. We gather to hear good news. This is what we do every Sunday, but this is especially put on display in Holy Week, when on Good Friday we see summed up in one image all that is bad. And then on Easter morning we see summed up all that is good, and best of all, that indeed God and his goodness win. This coronavirus is a bad and devastating thing in its own right, but it seems peculiarly cruel that in addition to it doing bad, it is also depriving us of one of our sources of consolation. Because of it, we are denied the tactile togetherness of our bodies that helps the meaning of all our tragedies and the beauty of all God's victories over them land deeply in our souls. That's what I've been thinking about recently. But then I spent some more time with Matthew's telling of that first Easter morning. And as I did, I began to realize that many of the things that make Easter tragically different this year are actually things that make it more eerily similar to that very first Easter morning. In other words, when you look at how we're required to celebrate Easter today in this unusual season of social and physical distancing, and then you look at how the first Easter morning really went some 2,000 years ago, one can't help but wonder if actually it's all the other regular Easters in between that are the unusual ones. I can't help but wonder if before us today is an opportunity like never before to experience that first early Easter morning. So look at the story again with me. The first thing to notice is the numbers. There's only a couple characters present on that first Easter morning. One has to ask, why are these two women not with the other disciples? Have they already divided themselves into separate groups and households? Which is to say, the first Easter was not a day where 3 times the normal Sunday crowd shows up, where the plate offering is double in one day what we typically get in a month. There's no lilies, no trumpets, no pastel colors or pearls or Easter egg hunts. The first Easter morning begins with just 2 people, Mary Magdalene and Mary, isolated from others, isolated from the world, just like us. Second, notice the emotion of the scene. That first Easter morning begins not with joy, but with grief about the present and fear about the future. Mary and Mary Magdalene are not traveling to the tomb expecting any kind of great miracle. Despite the crazy things that Jesus sometimes said, they knew that death was death, and they were simply there to pay their respects, to say one last goodbye to their beloved rabbi before they walked into a completely unknown and terrifying future. They were afraid of what was coming next. Does this mean the end of their whole movement? And then again, will coming after Jesus be enough to end it, or will they now come after us, his followers? The first Easter starts with grief and fear. The parallels to us on this point are too plain to even need mentioning. Third, notice the chaos of the scene. Mary and Mary Magdalene don't enjoy a nice leisurely walk to the tomb. On their way, the text tells us there is a great earthquake. This detail almost always gets skipped over, but it seems especially prescient now. There is a horrible natural disaster, not a pandemic, okay, but an earthquake is a community-wide crisis for sure. At the very least, it is something newsworthy enough to relegate the crucifixion of yet 3 more common criminals by the Roman Empire to back-page news. The point is, the scene at the tomb is not peaceful. There's also an angel who we're told whose appearance is, quote, like lightning. The text says, for fear of which the guards standing watch, quote, shook and became like dead men. This chaos is precisely what I was talking about at the beginning of the sermon. This Easter does not really feel like unambiguous joy. It feels a bit like chaos. Sure, we're exclaiming joy in here, and rightfully so, but it feels like the world is kind of ending out there. It feels like the ground of our reality is shaking underneath our feet. The final thing that is the same today as it was on that first Easter morning is the most important. And it's this, that we are still, in the end, confronted with an empty tomb. And here, in this final confrontation, we have arrived at the full scene for your imagination to contemplate. On this day of Easter in the year 33 AD and 2020 AD alike. This is the image I invite you to imagine. It is you, alone, surrounded by chaos, staring into an empty tomb. And you hear a voice saying to you, do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. This is the central moment of the first Easter today. This is the moment at the center of all time. And just like Mary Magdalene and Mary, you and I must decide what to do next. One thing this coronavirus has done is to remind us pretty starkly and pretty quickly of all the ultimate existential questions that we get to live most of our lives ignoring. We thought we had graduated beyond plagues. But to ignore such questions at a moment like this would be to freeze up like the soldiers, to stamp down whatever wonderings have wandered into your heart and head and wait for this all to pass so things can, quote, return to normal. That certainly is one option before you today. But your other option is to be like the Marys. Maybe one of the gifts inside of this tragic moment is that it has reintroduced us to those questions. Maybe now is a moment to stick with them and to see what happens. And notice, Jesus doesn't just pop around the corner. Mary Magdalene and Mary still have to go looking for him. The text says, so they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell the disciples. Did you notice that? They left quickly with fear and great joy. Just because they now believe or are at least open to the possibility of believing that Jesus has risen from the dead does not mean that fear is now forever behind them and that all their problems are now forever solved. Chasing after Jesus can be a frightening thing indeed. Choosing to change your life is always a scary prospect. But choosing to chase after Jesus inevitably brings great joy too. You still have a choice to make. And today, gazing at the empty tomb, alone and surrounded by chaos, I hope that you choose to chase after Jesus. Whether that's a decision you've never made before or a decision that you've made 1,000 times, go. Run. Because if what the angel says is true, And if Jesus really is alive, there is nothing in the world that matters more than that right now. And don't worry too much about finding Jesus once you've started running. In all the resurrection stories, it's Jesus who finds you. Suddenly Jesus meets them, is all it says in our story. Jesus shows up in many varied forms today. Jesus is still present in the church. Jesus is present in the faces of the poor and marginalized. Jesus is present in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, in the waters of baptism. But Jesus can also be present in the still, small, quiet spaces that will not be extinguished for all the chaos in the world. Jesus can be present in the bright scent of a flower, in the curiosity of a child, in the majesty of a single blade of grass. Jesus can be present with you right now, wherever you are, even in your isolation, even surrounded by chaos. When you start looking, you won't be able to help but find Jesus in all kinds of places. There's one last thing you should know before you decide. If Jesus really is alive, if the angel is right and the Bible is true, if death itself has truly been defeated, then there is nothing that can ultimately prevail against that victory. No plague, pestilence, or pandemic, no earthquake, fire, or flood, no violence, deceit, or rebellion, no pride, hatred, or hypocrisy, no evil thought, evil spirit, or evil enemy. If even death is defeated, then every evil we experience is only temporary. God in Christ has already walked through every valley of shadow and death and has come out the other side. And now, today, God in Christ is staring back at you with arms open wide, with love in his eyes, and he is waiting for your answer. Amen.